Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith.
Hi, I'm Serena Halstead.
And I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to Data Lit, a podcast for educators by educators. And we're leading into a pair of episodes focusing on some overlooked data, some different places where we can gather insights into what our students know and what they can do. And to get us started, I have a question for you two. So all three of us have kids. Let's say in the spring that we're going to get our kids playing a sport. Let's go basketball. It's March Madness. Go State. So, okay, our kids are going to play basketball. How might you want to gauge how it's going when they're playing after a few games, all that?
So for me, if the team is winning. Yeah.
Okay, so team wins and losses. Okay. Serena, what about you?
So for me, depending on the purpose that I put him in there for, my child, I want to see, is he getting what I send him there for? Because even though it's sports, I might have other things that I'm looking at. So I want to see if, for example, if the sport was for him to engage with more students, to have fun, not just to be winning. I want him to just be interacting. I'm going to be looking for that and seeing, is he happy? Is he wanting to go back? So that's how I'm going to be looking for that. How well is he doing?
I like that. So the purpose will determine what kind of data you want. And it might be some things that are quantified, like wins or losses or points or rebounds. And it might be things that are not necessarily turned into a number, like those relationships with peers, or even with like authority figures, with coaches, with referees, and it could even be almost this blend of the two, things like their movement on the court, off-ball movement, stuff like that you can't necessarily pin a number to, but you can observe. So this kind of speaks to the value of both quantitative and qualitative data, which is what we're going to be speaking about today. And I'll start with kind of unpacking a definition a little, because oftentimes this gets set up as just purely like numbers or not numbers.
Right.
But it goes a little bit deeper than that. And I really like for this an explanation that comes from Minichiello, and we'll drop those in the show notes, about the difference between quantitative and qualitative.
So how does he describe quantitative?
So conceptually, he looks at quantitative as being concerned with discovering facts about social phenomenon, and it assumes a fixed and measured reality, whereas qualitative is going to be more concerned with understanding behavior from the informant's perspective. That perspective matters there. And it assumes a dynamic and negotiated reality. You can also look at it in terms of the methodology, whereas quantitative, the data is collected through measuring things, and you get numerical comparisons, statistical analysis, whereas qualitative, the data is going to be collected through observation and interviews, and then you analyze by looking at themes, and the data is being reported in the language of the informant. Or put another way, John Smith from University of Northern Iowa sums it up as quantitative seeks for laws, while qualitative seeks for understanding. So that's kind of the big picture definitions, but let's try to ground it in the classroom to try to understand this dichotomy. So let's say, y'all, we're in the classroom, you're given an assessment. So recent classroom assessment, the average is, 75%, right? So that's kind of the quantitative, the average, and you can break that down into other quantitative data sources. But what contextual information might you want to know in order to better understand what's going on?
So for me, I usually start with diving into the student work to kind of better understand what made up that 75%, right? Like, can I figure out, because there's a 25% of quote unquote misunderstanding that's somewhat there. So for me, I'd have to dive into the student work and see if I can unpack what's making up that 25%.
I like that. So like if it's a math and it's a word problem and two kids get it incorrect, by looking at the processes for how they got there, if one kid was just guessing a number, or if another one did everything correct except they forgot to,
add a multiply
or something like that. And that can come, looking at the work, and can also come like talking to the students to get a sense. All right, Serena, what about you? What information might you want for this?
So that's 75%. I'm thinking about the students who have impacted that 75. In the class, we have our students who are performing really high. Then we have some students that are just, averaging. And then we have those students who are really struggling. And so when I look at that 75%, it makes me start thinking, how did the various groups in the class did? And so it makes me start thinking then, okay, I need to specifically look at, for example, their samples of work. For example, go back and look at something about some rubrics. However, I've been scoring them prior to now, this 75%. Were they doing fairly well, or were they, like pacing it all along? And then all of a sudden, this 75%, I was not expecting this. So I'm going to look back at some data that I've collected prior to this assessment to see how the students were doing. But then, going back to the qualitative idea, my conversations that I've been having with them, my discussions that I've been having, how are they talking in my group when I'm teaching? Are they interacting? Are they collaborating with each other? It makes me start thinking back, what was going on in the instructional realm in terms of how students were participating, and see how is that I was observing, that observation piece, how did that play a part in the 75 that the class gets?
Yeah, and that could even go beyond instructional. What's going on in your classroom or your community that might have an impact, So we're touching on there both the value of quantitative and qualitative data, that both them together can give you a better sense of what's going on, what students know, what students can do. So I think it's clear that there's value in both, but it seems like for some reason, oftentimes these two get pitted against each other. It almost becomes this dichotomy, this zero-sum game. And actually, in prepping for this article, I was reading some history. This goes back to like the 1800s. You have these like weird debates between positivism and idealism, and like mudslinging back and forth about like how science should operate. So this is nothing new, but in education, we sometimes prioritize one over the other. And Jennifer Ho out of University of California had an interesting quote that caught my attention with this. She wrote that the push for database decision-making in schools has largely centered on the use of quantitative data to inform technical, rational processes of teachers' decision-making. Previous attention to teachers' reliance on qualitative data, particularly unsystematically collected qualitative data, tends to focus on their use of intuition and is often characterized as counter to evidence-based inquiry. So why do you think we might prioritize quantitative over qualitative data in education? What do you think, Serena?
So I think we tend to do that, and I'm not speaking for everyone, but it's seemingly easier to quantify a problem. And so if you're thinking about a classroom with, say, for example, 25 students, you mentioned, 75% is the average. For example, the students are failing. It's easier that we want to ask the question, how many of them fail? Because we're looking at numbers of students. Now, if it's just a few of them that are failing, then we might maybe perhaps look at the qualitative side of it. So, for example, if 3 students in the class are failing, let us look at some behavioral data. Let us talk about what is going on with the student. Does the student has an IEP? Does the student have a behavioral plan? Then we want to look at that. But once it's 25 or more, we start thinking, okay, quantitative-wise, how many hours of instructional time? We start to look at students' attendance records. So we start looking at numbers because it's affecting the majority of the group. So I think that's mainly one of the reasons. We have so many students that we're dealing with, we tend to want to quickly quantify how many are not doing what is expected.
Mellisa, what do you think? Why do we prioritize quantitative over qualitative?
I like the fact that you said that this has been a long history. I think we've just been ingrained in us that numbers don't lie, right? That facts don't lie. So somehow when you see numbers, they have a meaning. So 3 has a meaning, 100 has a meaning, 75 have a meaning. I think, so when we see a number that has a meaning, but if you see something like words, misunderstanding, I don't know what that means. I have to figure out what does that mean. So quantitative stuff, you have to add or you have to get a bigger context to kind of make sense of it. But just by the natural sense of numbers, numbers have meaning. So I think that's why we gravitate to numbers, because we put all of this meaning. Like you can see 3 and you can make a decision. You're like 5, that means something. 100, numbers mean something. Words, not so much. So I think that's why we always see this preference for quantitative or for grades or for one value or numbers, because again, it's natural. You see a number and you can put a meaning to it. But anything else is like, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, and that almost creates this vicious cycle in that when we prioritize quantitative, then it makes it harder for us to gather the strong qualitative data, which then makes us more reluctant to use it. Like, for instance, our student survey, which is a tremendous piece of qualitative data at our disposal for every 5th through 12th grader. Last year, the response rate was under 36%, which, of course, there is certainly extenuating circumstances and all those kind of things.
But even look how you said that, right? So under 36%, that means something, right?
Yeah.
If it was 80-something, that would have a different meaning.
Yeah. So this source that could be tremendous qualitative data about how our students feel about instruction, schools, all those kind of things that can give a lot of context for it. Now, all of a sudden, it's harder for us to use.
And, going back to what Mellisa just said in terms of the numbers, when we see numbers, we can quickly, understand what the numbers mean. But when you think of the qualitative side of it, so the numbers tell you how many, but then when we think qualitative, we're now looking to define what is going on behind the numbers. And that definition part of it is sometimes so subjective. So we're looking at the qualitative side of, say, for example, 10 out of 15 students, the quantitative, 10 out of 15 students did well. Okay, that's okay. But when we start looking at the 5 that didn't do well, we're now defining the problem. And for example, Mellisa's perspective as to why the 5 didn't do well might be different from me, right? We're all 3 teachers in the grade, and we all start having different meanings behind why this 5 did not do well. And so because of that subjective nature of it, then we tend to want to stay away from the qualitative side because we don't want to hurt anyone's feeling, or we don't want to miss or bring any misinterpretations to what the 5 is doing. So we tend to let us stick to the quantitative. This is what it says.
Yeah, when in truth, there's subjectivity behind every data source.
Yes.
But it's just sometimes hidden in, and we talked about this a little with our rubric series that preceded this. Sometimes the subjectivity is hidden to the classroom teachers with a standard, multiple choice assessment that gives you really clean quantitative data. When there might be subjectivity about, what content was or was not included, what references were built into the word problems, all these kind of things there. But if it shoots out 18 out of 50, then we just think, 36%, when there's subjectivity there too. So I mentioned the student survey, which with higher response rates can be really useful qualitative data. What are some other examples of beneficial qualitative data for Wake County?
So I always think student observations or classroom observations. Like, teachers are constantly, that's a piece of data that you're capturing informally. Like, there's not like a formal structure for it, but it's very valuable because it adds to that other piece where you're knowing your kids. Mm-hmm. So I know we've all sort of experienced where a student didn't do too well in an assessment. And we were like, no, I know that kid, right? So, but that kid from observing that kid in class as an individual, was part of a group. Observations, the things that we're taking in, that is a really key part of the work that we do as educators. I think that's another piece that, again, we're capturing it daily, but how we process it or give credence to it or put it in place, you're just sort of taking it into your memory and holding it there in a bank until it's time to kind of use it.
I like that. And it empowers the classroom teachers as the experts that they are. They know the kids in their classroom. And I think we need to leverage that more. Yeah. Serena, what about you?
Before I get into that, Mellisa said something about we're observing informally. And it makes me think it's not just observing informally. We're also processing the ideas also informally. So that can be also, tricky. In terms of qualitative side, I'm thinking about, for example, behavioral data. We observe what is going on. And sometimes teachers definitely make an emphasis to collect this behavioral data. We actually do that because when we're coming up with individualized education plans and 504s, we have to be definitely documenting what we're observing so that we can generate these plans. So in terms of qualitative data, I would want to say documented behavioral data. Those are some qualitative data that we can actually look back on for our students.
Yeah, I like that. And I like, and as we'll talk about shortly, that you can still take a scientific approach to qualitative data to make sure it's telling what you want. Because my head for this went to just, informal conversations with students after a lesson. Just that sense of, collect the quantitative data with like an exit ticket or something.
Right.
But then also just chatting with kids to get a sense of how did they feel? How did they come into the classroom? How did this ring true to them? Which is a beneficial piece of qualitative data, but also one that could be ripe with biases if you're not careful.
Yeah.
You know, like which students am I talking to? Is just students that I have a particular relationship with? Are there cultural biases that might determine those kind of things there? That can kind of skew some of the qualitative data. But that kind of opens up some of the pitfalls that we can get with qualitative data. And Jennifer Ho touched on this when she warns that unstructured decision-making processes are open to a greater degree of bias. So I'm wondering, how can we address these concerns when we're collecting and analyzing qualitative data?
I think just being aware of your biases, right? As a teacher, you're constantly in that decision-making mode. And when you're looking at all the evidence, quantitative and qualitative, and trying to make sense of it and analyzing it, it's always good to kind of pause, stop, and reflect. Like, okay, where is all of this coming from? And just being aware, just constantly being in tune with your own biases about different things. We all have biases, and I think that's a hard thing to kind of recognize, that we all have these biases and they're in play, and they are some of the filters that are operating as you start to interpret data. So I think being aware of your biases is one way to kind of limit some of the subjectivity.
I like that. You know, that we just talked about acknowledging the subjectivity in any data source, and that doesn't mean that you reject it. You just are cognizant of it. Yeah. Serena, what about you?
In terms of addressing the noise, to say, when it comes to qualitative data, I think about monitoring your observations, being consistent with what you're actually looking at, looking at the time of the day that, whatever behavior is happening. For example, the lower grades, we give the kids those little popsicle sticks, the red, the blue, the green. And, you find that a child might be getting a lot of red popsicle stick at a certain time of the day. Are you really documenting that? Are you really observing what is going on here? And so I say document it in real time. So yes, the students are gone out of the class, but let's look back at those sticks and who got the most and make some notes about it. Because if you were asked to, develop an individualized plan for that child, you would have to actually monitor it in real time. So it's all about being deliberate in terms of how you're collecting that information and documenting it in real time. And then that documentation piece, it should have some structure to it. So when I say documented, we have different ways of collecting data. So could it be that we're looking at some frequency? How often is this happening? Or are we going to document this at the end of the week? Are we going to document this at the end of the day? Right? So being consistent in when we're documenting the information. And let's even talk about, for example, a child is not performing well, or a group of students are not performing well. We start looking at quantitative side, how many days were they absent? But what about looking at also, is a student being pulled out to go to the council at a certain time of the day, right? So we have to be consistent in how we're looking at what is going on with the students, beside numbers, what is happening. So documenting it and being mindful that even though it's qualitative data, there must be some structure in how you collect this data.
Yeah, I like that. Documenting it. Don't just let them sit in your gut or your memory, where they can become even more subjective over time, but document them, own it, think about it, analyze it. And that ties to, there's a really good article dropped in the show notes from Edutopia on using social emotional data. And they refer to the qualitative data there as warm data, which I thought was nice framing. And one of the things they stress is that warm data can be measured, graphed, and interpreted, which is kind of what you were touching on, Serena. And not only is that beneficial for you as the classroom teacher, but it can also be really useful for the kids themselves. They point out that the aim of utilizing warm data is to teach students how to recognize their emotions, express them, and self-advocate. And likewise, even for a classroom, you can get a sense of this warm data on a classroom level as well. So when you document, when you analyze this qualitative data, it's useful for you, but it's also modeling for kids that you can take a step back and monitor your own kind of contextual information that impacts how your school or job or whatever is going, which I thought was a nice point.
I think that also adds to that, it's not a either or, but both, right? It's like the intersection of both of them. Like your quantitative stuff tells you one thing, but your qualitative stuff also gives you some of that rich context for what, so you can better make sense of some of the quantitative. So I think I like that idea of, again, it's not a either or, but it's a and.
Yeah, because you can imagine a world in which there's just quantitative data. Well, here, let me ask you this. What happens if we're only looking at quantitative data?
So if we're only looking at quantitative data, we are missing the why. Why is this number, right? So like you mentioned, Mellisa, the quantitative gives us the how many, but the quantitative tells you the reason behind why something is happening. And so if we're only looking at the quantitative side of it, we're missing the piece that will be needed to fix. There's a problem to be fixed, right? Because sometimes there's no problem to be fixed. We just need to be adding more and getting better at what we're doing. But if there is a real deep-seated problem that is going on, if we're not looking at the qualitative side of it, we're going to be missing because we're only looking at numbers.
Or even you might not be aware that there are issues. Like going back to the basketball example, if my kid, this would not be the case because we have unathletic genes that we're passing on. But in theory, if Eva or Indy were dropping like 30 points per game or something, like, oh, that looks great. But then you watch and realize that, they're ball hogs, and they're not interacting well with their teammates.
Or the other kids can't play. I mean, if you put it in context, or the other kids can't play at all. Yeah. So the only ones who have sort of a sense, and the other kids are not interested in even playing. So their point, if you put them on another team, all of a sudden, like, wait, I thought I was a good player. If you put them on a team where all of the other kids are used to playing and are interested in playing, like, wait, I thought I was good, right? So it's all relative and subjective.
So then, Mellisa, let me ask you the opposite. What happens in a world where in education we're only looking at qualitative data and not quantitative data?
We get too sappy. No, but I mean, so you have understanding, but at some point you need some definitives, right? And I think that's what the quantitative data gives us, these definitive things to hang our hats on. So that's why I said you need both. You need a definitive, but as Serena said, the definitive, yes, so I see this number, but that helps me make sense of that number. So you need both of them.
So let me end with asking this question. I feel like I always make y'all do some strange poetic stuff, but I'm going to do it again. That's fine. So quantitative and qualitative data go together like?
The seasons of the year.
Oh, go on, why?
Because so we have 4 definitive seasons, right? But there's still anybody who's been living right now, like we're in a spring, summer, fall phase, like they all get blended together. So yes, they have on the calendar, they tell us this is when one season begins and one ends. But I mean, they also just blend together as well. To me, that's how I see quantitative and qualitative. There's some definitive aspects of it, but they also blend together as well with the qualitative. So that's how I put those two together.
I like that. You're saying that because this week we're going from like high 70s to low like 40s within 3 days. Yeah. Okay, Serena, what about you? Quantitative and qualitative data go together like?
I would say it goes together like ice cream and sprinkles. And I'm saying this because of what when we think about the classroom being heavily on the quantitative side. So the quantitative side is like the ice cream. And then the sprinklers is the qualitative side of it. It's being used, but it's not used as much as the
But it adds to the flavor, right?
Yeah. It's like you want a little extra, so we go for that little extra. Let us dig a little deeper to see what's going on. However, if we minus it, ice cream is still ice cream. Right.
But yeah, it does make it more appetizing, which I think
appealing.
Qualitative data can do that to some of the cold data, if you're going to use that framing, Yeah. I like that. And I'm going to go back to basketball for mine. You have to forgive me. This is one of the, you get like 1 year out of 10 that state has a decent team. So I'm going to own this in. But it's like a front court and back court in basketball, like big men or guards, You can have a team, and sometimes you'll try this, like, of all quick guards, but that's not going to work all the time. Or you can have a team in which, it's a bunch of, like, kind of tall, slow centers that are in the post, but you need a balance between the two, and perhaps to shift based on the circumstances where they're calling for. Okay, so that's the idea with quantitative and qualitative data, that there's value in each. And we're going to pick up here next time when we start digging deeper into student work as data and what that can reveal about what students know and are able to do. And if you have any questions or comments, or you want some further learning on any of these topics, You can access our website at www.wcpss.net/datalit. Thank you to Enloe High School's Maya Smith for the theme music. And thank you, dear listeners, for joining us today to talk about qualitative data. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.